Welcome back to Mr. Nightgrim. Tonight we're diving deep into the heart of America's forgotten corners, 10 most terrifying true small-town horror stories, real accounts from real people in real places that time forgot. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are documented incidents that happen to ordinary folks, just like you and me, in towns so small they barely exist on maps, where everyone knows everyone, except for the things that shouldn't exist at all. Before we begin our journey, I want to know, where are you listening from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? And if you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, something that made your skin crawl and your rational mind rebel, share it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and let's go. The job posting for Blackwood Canyon Fire Station seemed too good to be true. Decent pay, benefits, and all Jake Morrison had to do was monitor radio traffic and coordinate with the regional dispatch during fire season. After losing his construction job in the city, the quiet mountain town of Cedar Falls, population 847, felt like exactly the kind of fresh start he needed. Jake's supervisor, Chief Rawlings, was a weathered man in his 60s whose hands told stories of decades fighting fires. During orientation, he walked Jake through the communication protocols, pointing to a wall map dotted with numbered pins representing various fire watchtowers scattered throughout the canyon. Tower 7's been giving us some trouble lately, Rawlings mentioned casually, tapping a pin near the eastern ridge. Old equipment, probably. When you get reports from that sector, double-check with the Forestry Service before sending crews out. Jake nodded, making a mental note. The first few weeks passed without incident. Cedar Falls proved to be exactly what he'd hoped for. A place where the biggest excitement was Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a tree, and the local diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Then the reports from Tower 7 began. The first call came on a Tuesday night, around 2:17 a.m. Jake had been dozing at his desk when the radio crackled to life with static and a faint, distorted voice. Dispatch, Tower 7 reporting. Smoke visible, northeast sector. The transmission cut out abruptly. Jake tried to raise Tower 7 again, but got only static. Following protocol, he contacted the Forestry Service, who confirmed no visible smoke in that area. Jake logged it as equipment malfunction and went back to his crossword puzzle. But the reports kept coming, always between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Always the same distorted voice reporting smoke in the northeast sector. Always cutting out before Jake could respond properly. After the fifth incident, Jake asked Chief Rawlings about the equipment issues at Tower 7. The chief's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. His eyes went distant, unfocused, like he was looking at something Jake couldn't see. Tower 7? Rawlings repeated slowly. Yeah, the reports keep coming in, but I can never raise them back. Should we send someone up to check the equipment? Rawlings set down his mug with deliberate care. Son, there is no Tower 7. Jake pulled out the station map, pointing to the numbered pin. It's right here on the web. That tower was torn down 8 years ago. Rawlings' voice carried a weight that made Jake's skin prickle. Lightning strike during a storm. Killed the operator instantly. We demolished what was left of it the following spring. Jake stared at the map, then at his radio logs. 17 reports from Tower 7 in the past 3 weeks. All carefully documented. All time-stamped. All impossible. But I've been getting transmissions. What kind of transmissions? Rawlings' question came sharp and quick. Jake described the static-filled reports, the consistent timing, the distorted voice. As he spoke, Rawlings' face grew paler, the lines around his eyes deepening. Marcus Webb, Rawlings whispered. That was his name. The operator who died, worked Tower 7 for 12 years, never missed a shift. They say the lightning hit him while he was making his 2:30 a.m. report. That night, Jake couldn't concentrate on anything but the radio. As 2 a.m. approached, he positioned himself directly in front of the communication equipment, recorder ready. The station felt different in the pre-dawn hours, smaller, more isolated. Outside, Cedar Falls slept under a blanket of mountain darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. At 2:17 a.m., the radio hissed to life. Dispatch, Tower 7 reporting. This time Jake was ready. Tower 7, this is Cedar Falls Dispatch. Please confirm your location and status. Static, then clearer than before, smoke visible, northeast sector, spreading fast. Tower 7, You are not on our current roster. Please identify yourself." A long pause filled with electronic snow. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than radio waves should reach, "Marcus Webb, Tower 7. Something's wrong with the fire. It's not going out." Jake's hand trembled as he keyed the mic. "Marcus, Tower 7 was destroyed 8 years ago. You're not supposed to be there." The response came immediately, desperate and confused. 8 years. "No, I just started my shift. The lightning, it came so fast, but I have to report the smoke. It's everywhere now. It's in the walls, in the trees, in the air we breathe. Nobody's coming to put it out. Why isn't anyone coming?" Jake looked at the map, at the pin marking where Tower 7 used to stand. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Marcus, what do you see when you look outside?" Static stretched for nearly a minute. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried a terror that made Jake's blood freeze. "Nothing. I see nothing. Just smoke and darkness. And oh God, there are shapes in the smoke. They're moving. They're climbing the tower. They want in, but the fire won't let them. The fire protects me, but it never stops burning. It never stops burning." The transmission ended abruptly. Jake sat in the humming quiet of the dispatch office, staring at the radio like it might spontaneously combust. He tried to raise Tower 7 again, but got nothing but empty static. The next morning, Chief Rawlings found Jake still at his desk, the radio log spread out in front of him like evidence of a crime. Rawlings looked at the papers, then at Jake's hollow eyes. "You talked to him, didn't you?" Jake nodded slowly. "He thinks he's still on duty. He thinks the lightning just struck. Chief, what if he's been up there all this time, trying to do his job, not knowing that he's dead?" Rawlings finished the sentence with finality. "I've been getting reports about Tower 7 for 8 years, Jake. Every dispatcher we've had has talked to Marcus at least once. Most of them quit within a month. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because someone needs to answer when he calls." Rawlings moved to the window, looking out at the mountains where Tower 7 used to stand. "Marcus Webb was the best fire spotter we ever had. Saved dozens of lives over the years, prevented millions in property damage. If his spirit is still up there, still trying to protect this valley, then the least we can do is listen." Jake wanted to quit. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that he should pack his bags and drive back to the city where the dead stayed buried, and radio transmissions came from real, breathing people. But that night, he stayed at his desk. At 2:17 a.m., Tower 7 called in. "Dispatch, Tower 7 reporting. The smoke's getting thicker. I can barely see the ridgeline anymore." Jake took a deep breath and keyed the mic. "Tower 7, this is Cedar Falls Dispatch. We copy your report. What's your situation up there, Marcus?" "Jake?" The voice sounded surprised, almost hopeful. "Is that you? I've been trying to reach dispatch for hours. The fire's spreading, but it's not like any fire I've seen before. It doesn't consume anything. It just burns forever. And there are things in it, Jake. Things that shouldn't exist. We're monitoring the situation, Marcus. You're doing good work up there." For 8 years, Marcus Webb has continued his vigil from a tower that no longer exists, reporting fires that burn but never consume, watching for dangers that exist somewhere between life and death. Jake learned to expect his calls, to listen to his reports, to offer what comfort he could to a man trapped forever in his final moment of duty. The other dispatchers before Jake had been driven away by fear, but Jake understood something they hadn't. Sometimes the dead don't haunt us out of malice. Sometimes they haunt us because they're still trying to save our lives. And in Cedar Falls, where the mountains keep their secrets and the darkness runs deeper than mine shafts, Marcus Webb continues to watch over the valley from his impossible tower, reporting smoke that may be the only thing standing between the living world and whatever lurks in the spaces between reality. Jake still works the night shift. He still answers when Tower 7 calls. Because in a place like Cedar Falls, you learn that some duties transcend death, and some fires burn forever in the service of protecting the living from things far worse than flames. Dr. Sarah Chen had delivered hundreds of babies during her 15 years as the only pediatrician in Millbrook, but she'd never seen anything like the infant brought into the hospital that October night. The storm had been raging for hours, turning the small town streets into rivers and knocking out power to half the county. Sheriff Tom Bradley carried the baby through the emergency room doors just after midnight, his rain slicker dripping onto the worn linoleum floor. The infant was wrapped in a pale blue blanket, completely dry despite the torrential downpour outside. "Found her on the library steps," Bradley explained, his weathered face creased with concern. "Crying up a storm, but not a drop of rain on her. Strangest thing I've seen in 30 years of police work." Dr. Chen took the baby gently, immediately struck by how alert the infant seemed. Most newborns were sleepy, unfocused, but this child's dark eyes tracked movement with an intelligence that seemed far too advanced. The baby appeared healthy, well-fed, maybe 3 or 4 weeks old. "Any sign of the parents?" Dr. Chen asked, checking the infant's vitals. "None. No car in the lot, no footprints on the steps, though with this rain, that doesn't mean much." "But Sarah," Bradley's voice dropped lower. "The library's been closed for 6 months. Budget cuts. No one should have been anywhere near that building tonight." As Dr. Chen examined the infant more closely, she noticed the blanket. It was hand-knitted, the kind of careful work that spoke of love and patience. Embroidered in delicate script along one corner were the initials EMH. The stitching looked old-weathered, like it had been treasured for decades. "We'll need to contact social services in the morning," Dr. Chen said, wrapping the baby more securely. "But for tonight, she can stay in the nursery. I'll run some tests, make sure she's healthy." Bradley nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "One more thing, Doc. When I was walking up to the library, I could have sworn I saw lights on inside. But when I checked the doors after finding the baby, the place was locked up tight, dark as a tomb." The next morning brought more questions than answers. Dr. Chen's test revealed the infant to be in perfect health, but there were inconsistencies that gnawed at her medical training. The baby's development suggested she was about 4 weeks old, but her alert behavior and motor responses seemed more advanced. And then there was the matter of the birth records. When social worker Mary Hutchins arrived to begin the process of finding the child's family, she brought news that made Dr. Chen's blood run cold. "I've checked every hospital within a 200-mile radius," Mary explained, settling into a chair in Dr. Chen's office. "No birth records match this timeline, no missing infant reports. It's like this baby just appeared." Dr. Chen held up the blanket. "What about these initials? EMHE?" Mary's face went pale. She reached for the blanket with trembling fingers, examining the embroidered letters. "This stitching, it looks old. Really old. Dr. Chen, I need to make some calls." That afternoon, Mary returned with town clerk Eleanor Vasquez, an elderly woman who'd lived in Millbrook her entire 83 years. Eleanor took one look at the blanket and sank into a chair. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "Where did you find this?" "With the baby," Dr. Chen replied. "Do you recognize it?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "These initials, they're for Emma May Harper. She lived here in the 1940s. Lost her first baby to pneumonia when the little girl was just a month old. Emma kept that blanket for the rest of her life, said it was all she had left of her daughter." "Is Emma still alive?" Mary asked gently. "Oh honey, no. Emma died in 1963, but that's not the strangest part." Eleanor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Emma May Harper was the head librarian. She died in the fire that burned down the original library building 30 years ago, October 15th, 1993. Dr. Chen felt the room spin slightly. She looked at the infant's medical chart, at the birth date they'd estimated based on her development. October 15th, 2023. Exactly 30 years after the library fire. "That's impossible," Mary breathed. "The baby wasn't born 30 years ago. She's weeks old at most." But Eleanor was studying the infant with growing recognition. "Look at her eyes. Those are Harper eyes, that particular shade of dark brown. And the shape of her face." She shook her head in wonder. "This child looks exactly like Emma's baby pictures." Dr. Chen's rational mind rebelled against what they were suggesting, but the evidence was mounting in ways that defied medical explanation. That evening she decided to visit the site where the baby had been found. The old Carnegie Library stood at the corner of Main and Elm, its blackened brick facade a permanent reminder of the tragedy that had claimed Emma Harper's life. The new library had been built across town, but the old building remained too historically significant to demolish despite its condition. As Dr. Chen approached the front steps, she noticed something that made her stop. There, etched into the concrete near where Sheriff Bradley had found the baby, were the faint outlines of children's handprints, dozens of them pressed into the cement when it was still wet decades ago. A small brass plaque, green with age, read, "Dedicated to the children of Millbrook, may they always find sanctuary in learning. Emma May Harper, Head Librarian, 1963." That night, unable to sleep, Dr. Chen returned to the hospital to check on the infant. The baby was awake, alert, staring at the ceiling with those impossibly knowing eyes. Chen approached the crib. She could have sworn she smelled something that shouldn't have been possible in the sterile hospital environment, the scent of old books, vanilla candles, and wood smoke. "Who are you, little one?" she whispered. The baby turned toward her voice, and for just a moment, Dr. Chen saw something in those dark eyes that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't the innocent gaze of a newborn. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for 30 years to return to a world that had moved on without her. The next morning brought the final piece of the puzzle. Mary Hutchins arrived with a box of documents from the town archives, her hands shaking as she spread old photographs across Dr. Chen's desk. "I found Emma Harper's personal file," Mary said. "Look at this." The photograph was from 1962, showing a young woman holding a baby. The woman had kind eyes and gentle smile, but it was the infant that made Dr. Chen's breath catch. The baby in the picture was identical to the child they'd found, down to the alertness in her eyes and the shape of her tiny features. "There's more," Mary continued, pulling out a handwritten letter. "Emma wrote this to her sister just before the fire. Listen to this passage. I dream about my little Sarah every night. She would have been 31 this year if she'd lived. Sometimes I wake up feeling like she's calling to me, like she's trying to come home. I know it sounds foolish, but I've started leaving her blanket in the nursery, just in case." Dr. Chen's medical training screamed that what they were suggesting was impossible. Babies don't return from the dead. The past doesn't reach forward to reclaim what was lost. But in a small town like Millbrook, where 3 generations might work the same job and family histories stretch back through centuries, maybe the impossible carried its own kind of logic. The infant Sarah, as Emma had named her original daughter, remained in the hospital for 2 weeks while the authorities tried to determine her legal status. During that time, strange things began happening. Nurses reported that the baby never cried during the night shift, but they often found children's books on the floor near her crib, books that should have been locked away in storage. The hospital's old radiator system, which had been silent for months, began playing lullabies at exactly 3 a.m. Maintenance could never find the source of the music. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, staff members swore they could hear the sound of someone reading stories aloud in the empty nursery. A woman's voice, gentle and loving, speaking words of comfort to a child who had waited 30 years to hear them again. On Halloween night, exactly 2 weeks after she'd been found, the infant disappeared. Dr. Chen came in for her morning rounds to find the crib empty, the pale blue blanket folded neatly on the mattress. The hospital's security cameras showed nothing. The doors remained locked. It was as if the baby had simply faded away like morning mist. Sheriff Bradley searched the town for 3 days but found no trace of the child. The only clue was a report from Mrs. Grayson, who lived across from the old library. She claimed she'd seen lights moving inside the burned-out building on Halloween night and had heard the sound of a woman singing lullabies. Dr. Chen kept the blanket. Sometimes when the moon is dark and the town sleeps soundly, she drives past the old library and thinks she sees a soft glow in the upstairs windows, the warmth of a nursery, where a mother finally has her child back, where 30 years of waiting has ended in the kind of reunion that transcends the boundaries between life and death. The official report lists the case as infant of unknown origin, whereabouts unknown. But in Millbrook, where memory runs deeper than official records and love proves stronger than death, everyone knows the truth. Emma May Harper finally got her daughter back. And sometimes, on stormy October nights, you can still hear lullabies drifting from the old library, the sound of a mother's love that burned bright enough to reach across 3 decades and bring her baby home. Jenny Alvarez had been running the same road through Timber Creek for 3 months, ever since she'd moved to the small Oregon town for her new job at the ranger station. The 5-mile loop took her past weathered farmhouses, through the downtown strip of boarded-up storefronts, and along the edge of the dense forest that gave the town its name. It was the streetlight at the end of Maple Street that first caught her attention. Unlike the others, which cast their yellow glow over cracked pavement and faded crosswalks, this one pointed into the woods. Not toward any road or path, just into the thick tangle of Douglas fir and undergrowth that had been slowly reclaiming the town's edges for decades. The light itself seemed different too. dimmer than the rest, casting shadows that moved wrong in the evening breeze. Jenny had jogged past it dozens of times without thinking much about it, until the night she saw the figure standing beneath it. She was on her usual 7 p.m. run when movement in her peripheral vision made her slow to a stop. About 50 yards ahead, just within the yellow circle of the wayward streetlight, a silhouette stood motionless among the trees. The figure appeared to be a man, tall and lean, but something about his posture seemed off, too still, like a photograph rather than a living person. Jenny called out, thinking someone might be lost or hurt. "Hello? Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge her voice. As she jogged closer, details began to resolve in the dim light. The man wore dark clothing and stood with his back to the road, facing deeper into the forest. His arms hung at his sides with an unnatural stillness that made Jenny's skin crawl. When she reached the streetlight, the man was gone. Jenny stood at the edge of the woods, breathing hard from her run and from something else, a primitive fear that seemed to rise from the forest floor like morning mist. She aimed her phone's flashlight into the trees, following the beam deeper than the streetlight could reach. The ground around the light pole was disturbed, not with human footprints, but with something else entirely. Circular patterns in the dirt, like animals had been pacing around the base of the pole. Lots of animals, over and over again, wearing the earth down into concentric rings. Jenny hurried home but couldn't shake the image of the motionless figure. That night she called her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who'd lived in Timber Creek for 40 years. The streetlight at the end of Maple, Mrs. Kowalski's voice carried a note of caution. "Honey, that light's been broken since I moved here. Points the wrong way, barely works half the time. Town council's been meaning to fix it for decades. Have you ever seen anyone standing under it? In the woods?" A long pause. "Sometimes people think they see things in those trees. It's the way the shadows fall, plays tricks on your eyes. But I'd stay away from that area after dark if I were you. Animals get confused there. Dogs won't walk past it, deer won't cross that part of the forest. There's something about that spot that ain't right." The next evening, Jenny altered her route to avoid Maple Street entirely, but curiosity proved stronger than caution, and 3 days later she found herself jogging past the streetlight again, this time with a small digital camera tucked in her running belt. The figure was there again. This time Jenny was ready. She stopped at a safe distance and raised the camera, zooming in on the silhouette beneath the pale light. Through the viewfinder, she could see more details that shouldn't have been visible from so far away. The man wore a heavy coat despite the warm October evening. His hair was longer than she'd initially thought, hanging past his shoulders in lank strands. And his feet, Jenny's breath caught in her throat. His feet weren't quite touching the ground. She snapped several photos, the camera's flash briefly illuminating the entire scene. In that split second of harsh white light, Jenny saw the man's face. It was her face. Not similar features or a passing resemblance, but her exact face, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow and the slight crook in her nose from a childhood break. The man had her face, but his eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too aware, like he was looking directly at her through the camera lens. Jenny ran. She sprinted the 2 miles home faster than she'd ever covered the distance, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo the sound of her feet hitting pavement. At home, hands still shaking, she connected the camera to her laptop. The first few photos showed exactly what she'd seen, a tall figure standing in the woods beneath the streetlight. But as she scrolled through the images, each one showed the figure slightly closer to the road. The final photo, taken just before she'd run, showed empty woods. The man with her face was gone, but the animal tracks around the streetlight had multiplied into a complex maze of circles and spirals that seemed to pulse with their own geometry. Jenny tried to put the incident behind her, but sleep became elusive. Every night brought dreams of standing in dark woods, looking out at a brightly lit road where runners passed by in endless loops. In the dreams, she was the one beneath the streetlight, watching herself jog past, trying to warn her other self about something terrible that was coming. She began researching the history of Maple Street, spending hours in the town library's cramped historical section. What she found there made her blood run cold. Timber Creek had been built on land that was once a lumber camp. In 1923, during a particularly harsh winter, 17 loggers had gone missing from their work site. Their bodies were never found, but search parties reported strange phenomena in the forest, compasses spinning wildly, dogs refusing to track, and the persistent feeling of being watched from the trees. The missing men had been working a section of old-growth forest that was later cleared to become Maple Street. The streetlight in question had been installed directly over what the old survey maps marked as the loggers' last known campsite. But it was the final piece of information that made Jenny's hands tremble as she read. According to the lumber company's employment records, one of the missing loggers had been named James Alvarez, Jenny's great-grandfather, who family stories claimed had disappeared out west in the 1920s. That night, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay home, Jenny drove to Maple Street. She parked under a functioning streetlight 3 blocks away and walked to the forest's edge, armed with a powerful flashlight and her camera. The wayward streetlight flickered as she approached, its pale glow seeming to pulse like a heartbeat. The figure was there, as she'd known it would be. But this time, as she got closer, Jenny could see that it wasn't just one figure. There were 17 of them. They stood in a rough circle around the streetlight, each one wearing the clothes of a different era. Some dressed like 1920s loggers, others in more modern attire. All of them had the same 2 bright eyes, the same unnatural stillness. And all of them had her face. Jenny understood then, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at some deeper knowledge. The streetlight didn't point to nowhere. It pointed to when. The forest here existed in all times simultaneously, and the missing loggers had found a way to call across the decades for their family to join them. James Alvarez stepped forward from the circle, his logger's clothing hanging in tatters that suggested decades of waiting. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of nearly a century of solitude. "We've been waiting for you, Jenny, waiting for family to find us. The light calls to Alvarez's blood, draws us home, but we can't leave until the circle is complete." Jenny tried to run, but her feet felt rooted to the earth. The animal tracks around the streetlight weren't random. They formed a summoning circle, worn deep by decades of creatures drawn to serve something that existed between worlds. "You have a choice," James continued, his face, her face, showing infinite patience. "Join us willingly, and you'll remember who you were. Fight it, and you'll become like the others, lost between times, wearing whatever face the light chooses." Around the circle, the other figures nodded in unison. Jenny could see now that their faces weren't quite right. Features that almost matched hers, but were slightly off, like photographs printed with the wrong settings. These weren't family members. These were people who'd been caught by the light's call, transformed into something that could wait forever. Jenny made her choice. She ran toward the road, but the asphalt stretched away from her like taffy, the distance growing with each step. Behind her, 17 voices called her name in perfect harmony, patient as the forest itself. The streetlight's glow expanded until it filled her vision, and Jenny found herself standing in the circle, looking out at the road where a young woman jogged past in the evening light. The runner looked so much like her that Jenny tried to call out a warning. But her voice made no sound, and her feet couldn't move from the packed earth around the streetlight that pointed to nowhere, or perhaps everywhere, depending on when you were looking. The next morning, Jenny's supervisor at the ranger station filed a missing person report. Her car was found parked on Maple Street, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. The search teams found no trace of her, though several dogs became agitated near the forest edge and refused to continue tracking. Mrs. Kowalski, when interviewed by police, mentioned that she'd seen someone standing under the broken streetlight the night Jenny disappeared. But when pressed for details, she could only say that the figure had looked familiar, like someone she'd seen jogging through the neighborhood. The streetlight still points into the woods. Sometimes people report seeing silhouettes standing beneath it, usually just one, but occasionally more. The town council has discussed fixing it numerous times, but somehow the work orders always get lost or delayed. And if you jog past that corner of Maple Street at dusk, when the light is dim and the shadows run long, you might catch a glimpse of movement in the trees. Don't look too closely, especially if you have family who went missing out west decades ago. Some lights aren't meant to guide you home. Some lights are meant to keep you exactly where you are, standing in the place between then and now, waiting for someone else to complete the circle. The animals know this. That's why they pace around the streetlight in endless loops, wearing down the earth with their restless movement. They're not confused. They're keeping watch, making sure the circle stays strong enough to hold what shouldn't exist in any single moment. And Jenny Alvarez continues her eternal jog, watching for runners who look like family, ready to guide them home to a place that exists in all times, and none. The camping trip to Devil's Backbone State Forest was supposed to be a reunion, 4 college friends reconnecting after years of scattered careers and growing families. Mark Chen, now a software engineer in Seattle, had organized everything with the same obsessive attention to detail that had made him valedictorian 15 years earlier. Just like freshman year, he'd told his friends over group text, "Same woods, same campsite if we can get it, same terrible jokes around the fire." The others had agreed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Sarah worked as a veterinarian in Portland, Ben taught high school in Sacramento, and Lisa managed a small nonprofit in Denver. They were all pushing 40 now, carrying the weight of mortgages and marriages, and the quiet desperation that comes with realizing your youth is officially in the rearview mirror. They'd managed to reserve Site 17, the same isolated spot they'd claimed during their spring break camping trips 2 decades ago. The site sat at the end of a winding dirt road, backed up against old-growth forest that seemed to swallow sound and light with equal efficiency. The first 2 days passed exactly as Mark had hoped. They fell back into old rhythms. Sarah taking charge of meal planning, Ben providing a steady stream of increasingly ridiculous stories, Lisa documenting everything with the same enthusiasm she'd shown as their unofficial college photographer. The years seemed to melt away with each shared bottle of wine and every retold story. It was Lisa who first noticed the man in the trees. She'd gotten up before dawn on their 3rd morning to photograph the sunrise through the forest canopy. The light was perfect, streaming through the Douglas firs and golden columns that seemed to turn the woods into a cathedral. She was adjusting her camera settings when movement in her peripheral vision made her turn. About 50 yards into the trees, just barely visible in the dim morning light, a figure stood motionless between 2 massive tree trunks. At first, Lisa thought it was another camper. The forest was public land, after all, and they weren't the only ones who discovered this particular piece of wilderness. But something about the figure's posture struck her as odd. He stood perfectly still, facing their campsite, close enough that she could make out details of his clothing, but far enough that his features remained indistinct. What made Lisa's breath catch in her throat was the man's shirt. It was a faded black t-shirt with white lettering, the kind of design that becomes illegible after years of washing and wear. But Lisa recognized it immediately. It was Mark's shirt from their sophomore year, advertising some long-forgotten indie band that had played the college bar circuit. Mark had worn that shirt constantly, to parties and study sessions and camping trips, until the fabric grew thin enough to see through and the neck stretched out beyond saving. Lisa remembered the shirt because she'd had a brief, intense crush on Mark that year. She'd memorized everything about him, including his limited wardrobe rotation. The shirt had mysteriously disappeared during their junior year spring break trip. This same camping spot, actually. Mark had been convinced someone had stolen it from the clothesline he'd strung between 2 trees. Now, 20 years later, someone was wearing that exact shirt in the woods at dawn, watching their campsite from the shadows. Lisa raised her camera, zooming in as far as the lens would allow. Through the viewfinder, she could see more details that somehow made the situation worse. The shirt looked exactly as it had in college. Not vintage, but genuinely aged and worn. The man wearing it had roughly Mark's build from 20 years ago, tall and lean, with the kind of casual posture that came from being young and unconsciously confident. She snapped several photos, the camera's automatic flash briefly illuminating the forest. In that split second of harsh light, Lisa saw the man's face clearly. It was Mark's face from 20 years ago. Not similar features or a family resemblance, but Mark's exact face from their college days. Same sharp cheekbones, same unruly dark hair, same slight smirk that had made half the girls in their dorm fall in love with him. The only difference was the eyes, which seemed to hold a knowledge that college-age Mark had never possessed. When the flash faded, the figure was gone. Lisa stood in the growing daylight, camera still raised, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. It was possible, she reasoned. The combination of nostalgia, dim light, and wishful thinking could easily create false memories. She'd been drinking wine around the fire until well past midnight. Maybe she was still feeling the effects. But when she reviewed the photos on her camera's LCD screen, her rational explanations crumbled. The images clearly showed a figure in the forest wearing Mark's old shirt. The photos were sharp, well lit, undeniably real. And in each successive frame, the figure appeared to be slightly closer to the campsite. Lisa didn't mention the incident to the others over breakfast. Mark was in the middle of an elaborate story about his toddler daughter's latest antics, and the mood around the camp table was too light and nostalgic to disturb with something that sounded like the beginning of a horror movie. But throughout the day, Lisa found herself glancing toward the forest edge, looking for movement in the shadows between trees. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the hours passed, an itch between her shoulder blades that no amount of rational thinking could scratch away. That evening, as they sat around the fire sharing college memories, Mark mentioned the missing shirt. "I still think Ben stole it," he said, pointing an accusatory marshmallow-top stick at his friend. "You were always trying to steal my clothes." "Your fashion sense was terrible then, and it's terrible now," Ben replied, grinning. "Why would I want your ratty band shirts?" "That wasn't just any shirt," Mark protested with mock seriousness. "That was my lucky shirt. I got more phone numbers wearing that shirt than any other piece of clothing I've ever owned." Sarah laughed. "You got exactly 3 phone numbers in college, Mark, and 2 of them were fake. 3 more than Ben ever got." As her friends continued their good-natured roasting, Lisa felt the familiar prickle of being watched. She looked toward the forest, squinting to penetrate the darkness beyond the fire's reach. For just a moment, she thought she saw a flash of faded black fabric, but when she looked more directly, there was nothing. The next morning brought the same pre-dawn ritual. Lisa woke before the others, grabbed her camera, and stepped into the forest to catch the early light. This time she was looking for the figure. She didn't have to look hard. The man was closer now, maybe 30 yards from their tents, standing next to a massive cedar tree that would have hidden him completely from any other angle. The morning light illuminated him clearly, and Lisa's hands trembled as she raised her camera. The figure was definitely Mark, or rather, Mark as he had been 20 years ago. Same height, same build, same casual way of standing with his weight shifted to one hip. But his clothes weren't just from college, they were from this specific trip. Lisa recognized the khaki shorts, the hiking boots, even the worn leather watch band that Mark had eventually replaced during their senior year. Most disturbing of all, college Mark was looking directly at her through the camera lens, his eyes bright with recognition and something that might have been hunger. Lisa took the photos quickly, her finger hitting the shutter button in rapid succession. With each flash, college Mark seemed to move slightly, not walking, but somehow shifting position like frames in a stop-motion animation, closer to the campsite with each image. When she lowered the camera, he was gone again. That night, Lisa couldn't sleep. She lay in her tent listening to the sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustling that might have been small animals moving through the underbrush. Around 3 a.m., she heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the campsite at a consistent distance. Lisa pressed her ear to the tent wall, trying to track the sound. The footsteps moved with purpose, as if whoever was making them was studying the layout of their camp, learning the positions of each tent, and the best approaches through the trees. Lisa wanted to wake the others, but some primitive part of her brain insisted that movement or sound would be a mistake. Whatever was out there was hunting, and the worst thing she could do was reveal that she was awake and aware. The footsteps stopped directly outside her tent. Lisa held her breath, every muscle in her body rigid with terror. Through the thin nylon wall, she could hear breathing, slow, steady, patient. A hand pressed against the outside of her tent. Fingers splayed just inches from her head. The touch lingered for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the footsteps resumed their circuit, moving away toward the forest. The next morning, Lisa found the prints. They circled the entire campsite in a perfect ring, pressed deep into the soft earth. The treads matched Mark's hiking boots exactly. Not similar boots, but the exact same pattern of wear and tear that came from years of use. Lisa had spent enough time hiking with Mark to recognize the distinctive mark left by a rock chip in his right sole. But Mark's boots were sitting outside his tent, exactly where he'd left them the night before. Lisa photographed the prints with growing dread. When she compared them to a fresh print from Mark's actual boot, they were identical in every detail except age. The mysterious prints looked older somehow, as if they'd been pressed into earth that had dried and settled over decades rather than hours. On their final morning, Lisa woke to find college Mark standing at the edge of their campsite. He was less than 10 feet away, close enough that she could see the stubble on his jaw and the small scar above his left eyebrow that Mark had gotten in a childhood bike accident. He wore the complete outfit from their original spring break trip, the faded band shirt, khaki shorts, hiking boots, and the cheap digital watch that Mark had thought made him look sophisticated. College Mark smiled when he saw her looking, the same charming grin that had made Lisa's heart race 20 years ago. But his eyes held knowledge that college Mark had never possessed. The weight of decades, the patience of something that had been waiting far too long. He raised his hand in a casual wave, then pointed toward the forest. The gesture was an invitation, or perhaps a command. Lisa found herself standing, her body moving without conscious decision. College Mark had always been magnetic, the kind of person who could convince others to follow him into any adventure. Apparently, that charisma transcended the boundaries between past and present. She was halfway across the campsite when present Mark emerged from his tent, yawning and stretching in the morning light. "You're up early," he said, looking around the clearing, getting more sunrise shots. Lisa spun around, then looked back toward the forest edge. College Mark was gone, but she could see movement deeper in the trees, a flash of black fabric disappearing between the massive trunks. "Mark," she said urgently, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave right now." "What's wrong?" Mark's voice carried immediate concern. "Lisa, you look terrified." She tried to explain, showing him the photos on her camera, the boot prints around their campsite, the figure she'd been seeing in the forest. But as she spoke, she could see skepticism growing in Mark's eyes. "Lisa, honey, I think the stress of work might be getting to you more than you realize," he said gently. "These photos, they're pretty blurry, and the boot prints could be from any hiker." Lisa wanted to argue, but what could she say? That she'd been seeing a 20-year-old version of him stalking their campsite, that some part of Mark's past self had been left behind in these woods 2 decades ago and was now trying to reclaim what it had lost. They packed up camp and drove back to their respective cities, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they'd left something unfinished in the forest. The photos on her camera told a story that her friends couldn't or wouldn't believe, but she knew what she'd seen. 6 months later, Lisa received a package with no return address. Inside was a faded black t-shirt, soft with age and wear, advertising a band that had broken up before the turn of the century. A note was tucked inside the shirt, written in handwriting that perfectly matched Mark's college-era style. "Some things are meant to stay lost in the woods, but some things know how to find their way home. Thanks for the photos. I've been wondering what I looked like from the outside. See you next camping season." Lisa never went back to Devil's Backbone State Forest, but sometimes, late at night, she receives text messages from an unknown number. They're always photos taken from deep in the forest, showing their old campsite from impossible angles. In each photo, she can see a figure at the edge of the frame, college-age Mark, still wearing his lucky shirt, still waiting in the woods for his friends to come back and finish what they started 20 years ago. Mark, the software engineer, continues his life in Seattle, unaware that part of him never left the forest. But sometimes, when he's going through old photos or packing for business trips, he notices that certain clothes are missing from his wardrobe. Always clothes from college. Always pieces of the past that he thought he'd lost years ago. And deep in Devil's Backbone State Forest, College Mark adds each item to his collection, building a wardrobe that spans decades of memories, waiting patiently for the day when his older self returns to the woods and they can finally become one person again. The forest remembers everything, especially the parts of ourselves we leave behind in the places where we were happiest. And sometimes those abandoned pieces of our past get lonely enough to start walking. Eleanor Hatch had been postmaster of Copper Ridge for 37 years, ever since she'd returned from college to take over the job from her retiring father. In a town of 1,200 people spread across 50 square miles of Montana rangeland, she knew every address, every mailbox, and every family story that had ever passed through the Postal Service. The Copper Ridge Post Office sat on Main Street between Hendrick's Hardware and what used to be Miller's Diner, in a brick building that had served the community since 1923. Eleanor had seen the town shrink around her, the diner closing when Old Man Miller retired, the school consolidating with the district 20 miles east, young families moving away to find work in Billings or Great Falls. But the mail kept coming, and Eleanor kept sorting it with the same methodical precision she'd learned from her father. Bills and birthday cards, packages from distant relatives, government checks for the growing population of retirees who'd chosen Copper Ridge as their final stop, which made the water-stained envelope that appeared in Tuesday morning's mail delivery all the more unusual. Eleanor noticed it immediately as she sorted through the delivery truck's canvas bags. The envelope was old-fashioned, cream-colored paper with a formal business letterhead, but the postmark made her stop and read it twice. Copper Ridge, Montana. October 15 Virgola 2024. The problem was that today was October 8th, 2024. Eleanor examined the envelope more closely. The postmark was clear, machine printed with the kind of precision that ruled out human error. but a postmark dated 7 days into the future was impossible. The Postal Service's computers simply couldn't generate such a thing. The envelope was addressed to the people of Copper Ridge in elegant handwriting, with no return address. Eleanor weighed it carefully in her palm. It felt substantial, like it contained multiple pages, and the paper was water-stained in a way that suggested age and weather damage. According to postal regulations, Eleanor should have returned the envelope to the regional distribution center for investigation. Improperly dated mail was a federal matter, potentially involving mail fraud or systematic errors in the postal system. Instead, she locked the envelope in her desk drawer and tried to focus on her regular duties. But concentration proved impossible. The envelope seemed to radiate presence from inside the locked drawer, like a small animal trying to get out. Eleanor found herself glancing toward her desk every few minutes, wondering what message could be important enough to seemingly transcend time itself. That evening, alone in the post office after closing time, Eleanor gave in to curiosity. The envelope opened easily, as if it had been waiting. Inside were 3 sheets of cream paper covered in the same elegant handwriting as the address. The letter was dated October 15, 2024, exactly 7 days into the future. To the people of Copper Ridge, by the time you read this, the accident at the Horseshoe Mine will have already claimed 7 lives. The collapse will occur at approximately 2:30 p.m. when the support beams in Section C failed due to water damage from last week's storms. The trapped miners are James McKenna, age 34, his son David McKenna, age 19, Roberto Silva, age 41, Thomas Chen, age 45, Michael Bear Anderson, age 52, Frank Kowalski, age 38, and Samuel Wright, age 27. Emergency services will not reach them in time without advance warning. The mine's communication system will fail in the collapse, and the access road will be blocked by debris from the hillside. I cannot explain how this information reaches you, only that it must. Some knowledge transcends the normal flow of time when lives hang in the balance. Act quickly. Trust what you know to be true, even when it defies explanation. A friend. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling by the final pass. The Horseshoe Mine sat 15 miles northeast of town, employing about 40 people in the only industrial operation left in the county. James McKenna was the mine foreman, a man Eleanor had known since he was David's age. She delivered his wedding invitations, his son's birth announcements, and his father's death certificate. Roberto Silva lived just outside town with his wife and 3 daughters. Eleanor saw him every Wednesday when he came to mail money orders to relatives in Mexico. Bear Anderson was a fixture at the hardware store, a gentle giant who could fix anything mechanical and always had a joke ready for customers. These were real people with real families, and according to the impossible letter in Eleanor's hands, they would all be dead in 7 days. Eleanor looked at the postmark again, searching for any sign of tampering or fraud, but the ink was perfect, the paper genuinely aged, and the handwriting had the fluid consistency of someone writing quickly under pressure, not the careful forgery of someone trying to deceive. More troubling still, Eleanor recognized the handwriting. It was her own. Not similar to her script, but identical in every detail, the same slight leftward slant, the same way she dotted her I's, the same distinctive capital letters she'd been forming since elementary school. Eleanor had been writing her own name for 53 years. She knew her handwriting better than her own face. But she had no memory of writing this letter. Eleanor spent a sleepless night wrestling with impossible possibilities. Either someone was playing an elaborate prank, somehow forging her handwriting perfectly and creating false postmarks, or she was holding a genuine message from the future. The next morning brought new complications. Eleanor's assistant, Judy Morrison, noticed her distraction immediately. "You look like you saw a ghost, Eleanor. Everything all right?" Eleanor almost confided in Judy, but stopped herself. How could she explain a letter from the future without sounding like she'd lost her mind? Instead, she made a decision that violated every postal regulation she'd sworn to uphold. She called James McKenna. "Jim, it's Eleanor from the post office. I know this might sound strange, but I'm concerned about safety conditions at the mine. Have you had any structural inspections lately?" McKenna's voice carried the tired patience of a man who dealt with regulatory concerns for years. "Eleanor, we just had the state inspector out last month. Everything's up to code. Why are you asking?" "Well, with all the rain we've had, I was wondering about water damage, particularly in Section C." A long pause. "Eleanor, how do you know about Section C?" That's not information we share with the public." Eleanor felt her heart racing. I heard someone mention it at the diner." "The diner's been closed for 6 months." McKenna's voice had shifted from patience to suspicion. "Eleanor, what's going on? Are you feeling all right?" Eleanor hung up, realizing she'd made the situation worse. She couldn't warn people about the accident without revealing information she shouldn't possess, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that 7 men would die if she did nothing. The next few days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor found herself checking the calendar obsessively, watching October 15th approach with growing dread. She considered contacting the sheriff, the mayor, even the state mining authority, but each option seemed to lead to questions she couldn't answer. On October 14th, Eleanor made another decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She called in a bomb threat to the mine. Using a payphone at the gas station 20 miles away, she disguised her voice and reported a suspicious package in Section C of the Horseshoe Mine. The anonymous tip would force an evacuation and thorough search, keeping the miners out of danger during the critical time window mentioned in the letter. Eleanor returned to the post office feeling like she'd committed both a federal crime and the only moral act available to her. The bomb threat would be investigated, but at least the miners would be safe. At 2:30 p.m. on October 15th, the Horseshoe Mine collapsed. Section C caved in completely, just as the letter had predicted. Water damage from the previous week's storms had weakened the support beams beyond their tolerance limit. If the miners had been working their regular shift, all 7 men mentioned in the letter would have died. Instead, they were safely evacuated, standing in the parking lot with bomb squad technicians when the ground gave way. Eleanor heard the news from Sheriff Bradley, who called to update her on the investigation into the bomb threat. "Strangest thing," he said. "Whoever called in that threat saved 7 lives. We can't trace the call, but honestly, I'm not trying too hard. Sometimes you don't question a miracle." That evening, Eleanor returned to her desk drawer, where she'd kept the impossible letter. The envelope was still there, but something had changed. The water stains had faded and the paper looked newer, less aged. Most disturbing of all, the letter itself was different. The elegant handwriting was still unmistakably hers, but the message had changed. "To the people of Copper Ridge, the accident at the Horseshoe Mine has been prevented through your actions. 7 lives have been saved, and the timeline has been corrected. You have proven that knowledge, when used with courage and compassion, can transcend the normal boundaries of time and space. But every action creates new possibilities, new futures that must be monitored, and when necessary, corrected. You will receive more letters. Some will describe tragedies that can be prevented. Others will warn of consequences that your interventions have created. Trust your instincts. Act with wisdom. Remember that some futures are meant to be changed, while others must be preserved at all cost. The responsibility is now yours." Eleanor Hatch, October 15th, 2029. Eleanor read the letter with growing horror. The signature was her own name, but the date was 5 years in the future. The implication was clear. Somehow her future self was sending messages back through time, using the Copper Ridge post office as a bridge between past and future. But if she was sending letters from 2029, what had happened in the intervening years? What knowledge had she gained that allowed her to manipulate time itself? Eleanor locked the new letter in her desk drawer, but she knew it wouldn't be the last. She had become part of something larger than a small-town post office, something that used her handwriting and her postal system to change the course of history, one prevented tragedy at a time. Over the following months, more letters arrived with future postmarks. They warned of accidents, natural disasters, and personal tragedies, all dated precisely enough to allow for intervention, all written in Eleanor's handwriting from progressively further into the future. Eleanor prevented a school bus accident by reporting brake problems that hadn't happened yet. She saved a family from carbon monoxide poisoning by anonymously calling in a gas leak that wouldn't occur for 3 days. Each intervention worked perfectly, but each letter from her future self grew more cryptic and disturbing. The final letter arrived on Christmas Eve, postmarked December 24th, 2034. Eleanor, the letters must stop. The interventions have created too many changes, too many paradoxes. Time is becoming unstable around Copper Ridge, and the consequences are spreading beyond our small town. You have saved 127 lives over the past 5 years, but saving those lives has prevented 1,847 other people from being born, changed the outcomes of 3 elections, and altered the course of scientific discoveries that won't be made now because the people who would have made them were never conceived. I am writing this letter from a world that no longer exists in your timeline. By the time you read it, I will have already ceased to exist as well. The post office will burn down tomorrow night. Let it burn. Destroy all the letters, all the evidence of what we've done. Return time to its natural course. Some futures, no matter how tragic, are meant to happen exactly as they were originally written. Thank you for your service to the people of Copper Ridge, and goodbye. Eleanor Hatch, December 24th, 2034. P.S. Don't try to prevent the fire. Paradox is a patient hunter, and it has finally found us. Eleanor read the letter by the light of her desk lamp, feeling the weight of 5 years' worth of impossible decisions pressing down on her shoulders. Outside, snow fell steadily on Main Street, covering Copper Ridge in the same white silence that had blanketed the town every Christmas Eve of her life. At 11:47 p.m., she smelled smoke. Eleanor had 13 minutes to save decades of postal records, family photographs, and the accumulated history of a small town. Instead, she gathered all the letters from the future, dozens of them now, covering 5 years of prevented tragedies, and fed them into the flames that were already consuming the building's east wall. The Copper Ridge post office burned to the ground on December 25th, 2024. Eleanor lost everything: her job, her father's legacy, and the supernatural responsibility that had been thrust upon her by a future self she would now never become. But 127 people continued living lives they were never meant to have, and in the end, Eleanor decided that was worth the price of paradox. The new post office was built 6 months later, staffed by a young man transferred from Great Falls who had no knowledge of temporal letters or impossible postmarks. Eleanor retired to a small house on the edge of town, where she tended a garden and never again wondered what the future might hold. Sometimes late at night, she found herself writing letters in her sleep, elegant script flowing across cream-colored paper, describing tragedies that might or might not come to pass. But she always burned these letters in the morning, returning their warnings to ash and smoke before they could find their way into the past. Time, Eleanor learned, was far more fragile than anyone imagined, and some knowledge was too dangerous to possess, even when it came wrapped in the familiar comfort of your own handwriting, postmarked from a future that might never exist. Every spring in Millfield, the old-timers started watching the calendar, not for Easter or tax deadlines, but for the fog. It came every year on the same date, April 17th, rolling through the same 3 blocks of downtown like clockwork. Main Street from the defunct lumber mill to the old church, Pine Avenue from the hardware store to the cemetery gate, and Elm Street from the school to the abandoned train depot. The fog lasted exactly 17 minutes, from 3:13 p.m. to 3:30 p.m., and it carried with it the unmistakable smell of burning hair. Sarah Martinez had lived in Millfield for only 2 years, having moved there from Portland to take over as the town's librarian after the previous one retired. She'd heard the locals talk about the shift in hushed tones, but had assumed it was just another piece of small-town folklore, like the stories about the ghost in the old mill, or the Native American burial ground that supposedly lay beneath the elementary school. Then she experienced it firsthand. Sarah was walking back to the library from lunch at Morrison's Cafe when the fog began to form. It started as wisps of vapor rising from the storm drains, delicate tendrils that caught the afternoon sunlight like spiderwebs. Within minutes, the wisps had thickened into a solid wall of gray-white mist that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. The smell hit her immediately, acrid, organic, nauseating. It was the smell of hair being singed by a curling iron, magnified 1,000-fold, and mixed with something else that Sarah couldn't quite identify, something metallic and sharp that made her eyes water and her throat close. But it was the disorientation that terrified her most. Sarah had been walking on a familiar street, past buildings she'd seen every day for 2 years. But as the fog thickened around her, nothing looked right. The Morrison's Cafe she'd just left was gone, replaced by a building with different windows, and a sign she couldn't read through the mist. The street beneath her feet felt wrong, cobblestones instead of asphalt, with gaps that caught her heels and made walking treacherous. Most disturbing of all were the sounds. Through the fog, Sarah could hear voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Not Spanish or the bits of German that some of the older residents still used, but something entirely foreign. The voices carried the cadence of normal conversation, but the words themselves seemed to slide past her comprehension like water. Sarah tried to retrace her steps to the cafe, but the fog had disoriented her completely. Every direction looked the same, gray mist punctuated by the shadowy outlines of buildings that seemed to shift position when she wasn't looking directly at them. She called out for help, but her voice was swallowed by the fog as if the mist itself was absorbing sound. The foreign voices continued their incomprehensible conversations, seemingly unaware of her presence. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to dissipate. Sarah watched the gray walls thin and dissolve, revealing familiar streets and buildings that made sense again. Morrison's cafe stood exactly where it should be, unchanged. The street was paved with the same cracked asphalt she'd walked on earlier. Everything was normal, except for the lingering smell of burnt hair and the metallic taste in her mouth. Sarah checked her watch, 3:30 p.m. exactly. That evening, she visited Morrison's cafe to ask about the fog. The owner, Tom Morrison, was a third-generation Millfield resident, whose family had run the cafe since the 1940s. "Oh, you got caught in the shift," he said, not looking up from the coffee cups he was washing. "Happens to newcomers sometimes. Most folks know to stay indoors between 3:10 and 3:35 on April 17th. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Some kind of weather phenomenon?" Tom's hands stilled on the dish towel. He looked around the empty cafe, then leaned closer to Sarah's table. "It's not weather," he said quietly. Well, nobody really knows what it is, but it's been happening every year since 1962. "What happened in 1962? Tom's expression grew troubled. "That was the year of the mill fire, biggest tragedy in Millfield's history. 17 workers died when the sawdust caught fire, and the building went up in minutes. Happened on April 17th. Right around 3:15 in the afternoon." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "The same time the fog appears. And the same smell," Tom continued. "Witnesses said the fire burned so hot it singed the hair of people standing across the street. Emergency responders had to be treated for smoke inhalation, and they all reported the same thing. It smelled like burning hair mixed with something chemical from the lumber treatments." "But what does that have to do with the fog?" Tom returned to his dishes, but his movements were nervous, distracted. "Some folks think the fire never really went out, that it's still burning somewhere else, somewhere that overlaps with our world for 17 minutes every year." Sarah thought about the voices she'd heard, the unfamiliar language, the buildings that had looked wrong through the mist. "Tom, during the fog, do you ever hear voices? People speaking in a foreign language?" Tom's dish towel dropped to the floor. "You heard them too?" "You've heard them? Everyone who gets caught in the shift hears them. The voices, the footsteps, sometimes even laughter. But they're not speaking a foreign language, Sarah." Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They're speaking English. Old English, from the 1960s. But when you're in the shift, your brain can't process it right. Everything gets translated wrong." That night, Sarah researched the 1962 mill fire at the library's archives. The newspaper accounts were horrific. 17 men trapped in a building that became an inferno in less than 5 minutes. The fire had burned so hot that it took days to cool enough for investigators to enter, and when they did, they found something that had puzzled them for decades. The bodies were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the mill floor, holding hands like they'd been performing some kind of ritual. The official explanation was that the men had tried to stay together for comfort in their final moments, but witnesses reported that the workers had been scattered throughout the building when the fire started. How they'd ended up in that formation remained a mystery. Sarah found more disturbing details in the investigation files. The fire had started simultaneously in 17 different locations throughout the mill, as if someone had deliberately set multiple ignition points. But all 17 workers had been accounted for, and there was no evidence of arson or external sabotage. The mill's owner, James Hartley, had committed suicide 3 days after the fire, leaving behind a note that simply read, "They wanted to show me something important. I should have listened." As spring approached the following year, Sarah found herself growing anxious. She'd marked April 17th on her calendar and made plans to be safely inside the library when 3:13 p.m. arrived. But as the date drew closer, she began experiencing strange dreams. In the dreams, she was walking through Millfield, but it was a different version of the town. The buildings were older, the streets unpaved, and the air was filled with the sound of sawmills and lumber trucks. She could smell wood smoke and sawdust, and everywhere she looked, she saw men in work clothes and hard hats going about their daily routines. But the most disturbing part of the dreams was the knowledge that she was seeing Millfield as it existed during the shift, the town caught in its final 17 minutes before everything changed forever. On April 17th, Sarah positioned herself at the library's front window with a video camera and notebook, determined to document whatever happened during the shift. At 3:13 p.m., she watched the fog begin to form in the streets below. This time she was ready for what she saw. Through her window, the fog revealed glimpses of another Millfield entirely. The mill was intact and operational, with workers visible through the windows. The streets were busy with people in 1960s clothing, going about their daily business, with no awareness that their world was about to end in flames. But Sarah could see something they couldn't: shadows moving through the fog, dark figures that didn't belong to either time period. The shadows were watching the workers, following them, herding them toward the mill like invisible shepherds guiding their flock. Sarah tried to record what she was seeing, but the camera captured only normal fog and empty streets. Whatever was happening existed in a wavelength that technology couldn't detect, visible only to human eyes that were present during the shift itself. As 3:30 approached, Sarah watched the shadows converge on the mill. She could see the workers inside gathering in the center of the building, their movements becoming synchronized as if they were being controlled by something external. Then the fog disappeared, taking with it the glimpse into Millfield's past. But this time, Sarah was left with more than just the smell of burning hair and the taste of metal in her mouth. She was left with the knowledge that the mill fire hadn't been an accident. Something had wanted those 17 men to die in that specific way, at that specific time, in that specific formation. And every year since, for exactly 17 minutes, that something returned to relive its triumph. Sarah began researching the history of Millfield before 1962, looking for clues about what might have orchestrated the mill fire. What she found in the town records was a pattern of tragedies stretching back to the town's founding in 1892. Every 30 years, exactly 30 years, 17 people died in Millfield under mysterious circumstances. Sometimes it was accidents, a bridge collapse, a building fire, a mining cave-in. Sometimes it was illness, a plague that affected only 17 people, leaving everyone else untouched. But always 17 deaths, always in a formation that suggested the victims had been arranged post-mortem, and always followed by a period of unusual prosperity for the surviving townspeople. The mill fire had been the latest in this cycle, which meant the next occurrence was due in 1992. But 1992 had come and gone without incident, breaking a pattern that had held for 70 years. Sarah realized with growing horror that the shift wasn't just a supernatural replay of the mill fire. It was a failed attempt to collect the 17 lives that were still owed. And every year, the entity behind the pattern grew stronger. The fog lasted longer, and the boundary between past and present grew thinner. The old-timers of Millfield knew to stay inside during the shift, not just to avoid disorientation, but to avoid becoming the 17 souls that the town's supernatural creditor was still trying to collect. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to a rational, city-educated mind just 2 years earlier. She gathered 17 volunteers from among Millfield's population, people who were terminally ill, elderly, or simply tired of living in fear. On April 17th of her third year in Millfield, as the fog began to form, Sarah led the volunteers into the street. The shift welcomed them with the smell of burning hair and the whisper of foreign voices that weren't foreign at all, just filtered through decades of supernatural interference. The volunteers joined hands in the center of Main Street, forming the same circle that the mill workers had formed 61 years earlier. But this time, the sacrifice was willing. The fog lasted 18 minutes that year, 1 minute longer than usual. When it cleared, Sarah and her 16 volunteers were gone, but the smell of burning hair never returned to Millfield. The shift ended forever, satisfied at last by the debt that Sarah had helped the town pay. The new librarian, hired from the county system, found Sarah's research notes in her desk drawer. The final entry, dated April 16th, read simply, "Some debts can only be paid with willing souls. Some patterns can only be broken by people brave enough to step into the fire. The town will be safe now. The fog will never come again." And it never did. But on still April afternoons, when the light hits the streets of Millfield just right, some people report catching a whiff of something burning in the air. Not hair this time, but incense and candles, like prayers being offered in gratitude by 17 souls who finally found the peace that had been denied to them for over a century. The bell tower of St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church had been silent for 15 years when it rang for Harold Webster at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in September. Father Michael Casey woke to the sound echoing across the valley, a single mournful toll that seemed to hang in the night air longer than physics should have allowed. He lay in bed in the rectory, listening to the silence that followed, wondering if he'd dreamed the sound. But he knew he hadn't. St. Bartholomew's had served the mountain community of Cedar Hollow for over a century, its bronze bell marking the passage of time and the passage of souls with equal solemnity. The tradition was older than anyone could remember, one toll for each person who died in the valley, rung within hours of their passing as a way of honoring the departed and letting the community know that one of their own had gone home. The bell had rung for Father Casey's predecessor, for the banker who'd embezzled pension funds before shooting himself, for the Henderson baby who'd been stillborn last winter. It rang for the old and the young, the beloved and the despised, making no judgments about the lives it commemorated. But 15 years ago, the rope mechanism had snapped during a particularly violent thunderstorm, and the church's dwindling congregation couldn't afford the repairs. The bell had sat silent since then, a bronze monument to traditions that the modern world was slowly abandoning. So when Father Casey heard it ring for Harold Webster, his first reaction was confusion. His second reaction was terror because Harold Webster wasn't dead. Father Casey had visited Harold just that afternoon. The 73-year-old widower lived alone in a cabin 3 miles up Pinecrest Road, surviving on Social Security and the vegetables he coaxed from his rocky garden. Harold had been in good health, good spirits, and had been planning to attend Sunday service for the first time in months. But at 3:17 a.m., St. Bartholomew's bell had rung once for Harold Webster, announcing his death to the valley with the same certainty it had shown for 100 years. Father Casey dressed quickly and drove through the pre-dawn darkness to Harold's cabin. The old man answered the door in his bathrobe, bleary-eyed but very much alive. "Father Casey, what are you doing here at this hour? Is everything all right?" "Harold, I heard the church bell ring. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Harold's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been fear. "The bell rang, but I thought it was broken." "It is broken. That's why I'm here." They stood on Harold's front porch in the cold mountain air, two men trying to make sense of something that defied rational explanation. Harold invited Father Casey inside for coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table discussing possibilities that seemed increasingly absurd as the night wore on. "Maybe it was wind," Harold suggested. "Strong wind can sometimes move broken mechanisms." But there had been no wind that night. The air had been still, almost oppressively so. "Maybe it was another bell," Father Casey offered, "from the Catholic church down in Pine Valley." But Pine Valley was 30 miles away, and its church had no bell at all. As dawn approached, both men were forced to confront the impossible truth. The broken bell of St. Bartholomew's had rung to announce Harold's death, despite the fact that Harold was very much alive. Father Casey left Harold's cabin with a promise to investigate the bell mechanism, but they both knew that whatever had happened wasn't mechanical in nature. Over the next week, Father Casey found himself checking on Harold obsessively. He called every morning, stopped by every afternoon, and found excuses to drive past the cabin every evening. Harold seemed healthy, but Father Casey couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching a man living on borrowed time. On the 8th day after the bell had rung, Harold called the rectory at 6 a.m. "Father, something's wrong with me." Harold's voice was thick, distorted, like he was speaking through a mouthful of cotton. "I've been coughing up. Well, you need to see this." Father Casey drove to Harold's cabin to find the old man standing in his bathroom, staring at the sink with an expression of absolute horror. The porcelain was stained with blood, and something else, small white objects that looked disturbingly familiar. Teeth. Harold had coughed up 7 teeth overnight. Perfectly healthy molars and incisors that had simply fallen out of his mouth while he slept. "I can't remember my daughter's name," Harold said, his words slurred by the gaps in his mouth. "Sarah, I think. Or was it Susan? I've been trying to remember all morning, but it's like trying to grab smoke." Father Casey drove Harold to the hospital in Pine Valley, but the doctors couldn't explain what was happening. The blood work was normal, the x-rays showed no abnormalities, and Harold's overall health appeared to be excellent, despite the inexplicable tooth loss and memory problems. "It's probably stress-related," Dr. Martinez explained to Father Casey in the hallway. "Sometimes psychological trauma can manifest in physical symptoms. Has Mr. Webster experienced any recent losses? Death of a spouse or close friend? Father Casey wanted to explain about the bell, about the impossible warning that had preceded Harold's decline by exactly 1 week. But how could he tell a man of science that a broken church bell was predicting death with supernatural accuracy? Instead, he took Harold home and waited. The symptoms worsened daily. Harold's memory continued to deteriorate, but in strange, selective ways. He could remember every detail of his childhood, every conversation he'd had with his late wife, every sermon Father Casey had delivered over the past 5 years, but he couldn't remember his daughter's name, couldn't recall what he'd eaten for breakfast, and kept referring to his neighbor's dog by the name of a pet that had died 20 years earlier. Most disturbing of all, Harold began talking about someone digging from beneath. "Can't you hear it?" he asked Father Casey during one afternoon visit. "The scratching sound under the floorboards? Someone's down there digging their way up. They've been at it for days now." Father Casey listened carefully but heard nothing except the normal settling sounds of an old cabin. When he looked under the house, he found only undisturbed earth and the stone foundation that Harold's father had laid in 1952. But Harold's conviction never wavered. He spent hours pressing his ear to the floor, mapping the progress of invisible diggers who were supposedly tunneling toward his home from somewhere deep underground. "They're almost through," Harold announced on the 14th day after the bell had rung. "I can hear them right beneath the kitchen now. They're going to break through tonight." Father Casey considered taking Harold to a psychiatric facility, but something held him back. Maybe it was the certainty in Harold's voice, or the way the old man's eyes tracked movement that wasn't there, or simply the impossibility of everything that had happened since the broken bell had first tolled. That night, Father Casey stayed at Harold's cabin. They sat in the living room, Harold in his recliner and Father Casey on the couch, both men listening to the silence of the mountain night. At 11:30 p.m., Harold suddenly sat upright, his remaining teeth bared in what might have been a smile or a grimace. "They're here," he whispered. Father Casey heard it then, a sound like fingernails scraping against wood, coming from directly beneath their feet. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices speaking in urgent whispers. The kitchen floor began to bulge upward. Father Casey watched in horror as the wooden planks warped and cracked, pushed up from below by something that shouldn't have existed. The scraping sounds became frantic, desperate, like creatures that had been trapped underground for decades and could finally taste freedom. Harold stood up and walked toward the kitchen with the calm acceptance of someone who had been expecting this moment for 2 weeks. "Harold, don't," Father Casey called, but the old man didn't stop. The kitchen floor exploded upward in a shower of splinters and dust. Dark shapes poured through the opening, not fully visible but undeniably present. They moved like shadows given weight, like holes in reality that had learned to walk. Harold stepped forward to meet them, and Father Casey understood with crystal clarity that the broken bell had been right all along. Harold Webster had been dead for 2 weeks. Whatever had been walking around in his body, losing teeth and forgetting names and hearing sounds from underground, had been something else entirely, a placeholder, a shadow, a way of marking time until the real Harold could be properly collected. The shapes surrounded Harold, and for just a moment, Father Casey saw them clearly. They were people, or had been people once, residents of Cedar Hollow, who had died over the decades, still wearing the clothes they'd been buried in, their faces bearing the patient expressions of those who had been waiting for a very long time. Harold's body collapsed like an empty suit of clothes, as whatever had been animating it departed. The shapes gathered around the fallen form, lifting it gently, carrying it down through the hole in the kitchen floor. The last thing Father Casey heard before the floor sealed itself was the sound of the church bell ringing once more, a single final toll that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the earth. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. Harold Webster's body was found in his kitchen by Father Casey, who had come to check on him after missing their usual morning phone call. The coroner estimated that Harold had been dead for several hours, probably since sometime around midnight. Father Casey never mentioned the hole in the kitchen floor, which had somehow repaired itself by morning. He never spoke about the 2 weeks of impossible symptoms that had preceded Harold's death, or the way the broken church bell had announced his passing before it happened. But he began paying closer attention to the bell tower. Over the following months, St. Bartholomew's bell rang 3 more times, once for Emma Patterson, who developed sudden-onset dementia and began insisting that her dead husband was still alive. Once for Robert Chen, who started coughing up coins and claiming that strangers were living in his basement, and once for Mary Sullivan, who lost the ability to recognize her own reflection and spent her final days preparing meals for invisible dinner guests. Each time the bell rang exactly 2 weeks before the person's official death. Each time the intervening period was marked by symptoms that seemed designed to prepare the person for whatever was coming. And each time Father Casey found evidence of something digging disturbed earth around foundations, scratching sounds in crawl spaces, the persistent feeling that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was growing thinner. Father Casey began keeping a journal, documenting each occurrence, trying to find a pattern that might explain why certain people were chosen. But the only common factor seemed to be age. All the victims were elderly, isolated, and had few close family ties. It was as if something underground was calling in the community's forgotten souls, collecting those who wouldn't be missed too quickly or mourned too deeply. The bell still rings in Cedar Hollow, though the church officially closed last year due to declining membership. Father Casey moved to a parish in the city, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon the valley entirely. He maintains a small apartment above the general store and continues to monitor the bell's activities. Local residents have learned to listen for the single mournful toll that announces death before it happens. When the bell rings, everyone knows to pay attention to their elderly neighbors, to watch for the signs that indicate someone is being prepared for collection. But they also know that there's nothing they can do to stop what's coming. The bell doesn't ring as a warning, it rings as a confirmation. By the time you hear it, the process has already begun, and the only question is whether the person will spend their final 2 weeks among the living, or among the shadows of those who are already gone. St. Bartholomew's bell continues to keep perfect time, marking not the hours of the day, but the countdown to eternity. And deep beneath Cedar Hollow, in tunnels that don't appear on any geological survey, something continues to dig, preparing new passages for souls that haven't been collected yet, but will be soon enough. The bell knows who's next. It always knows. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the earth, patient voices whisper names that won't be spoken aloud until exactly 2 weeks before their owners join the eternal congregation that gathers in places where broken bells still ring with perfect accuracy. Tommy Brennan was plowing the South 40 when his tractor blade hit something that shouldn't have been buried in Indiana farmland. The impact sent vibrations through the machine's frame and nearly threw him from his seat. He killed the engine and climbed down to inspect the obstruction, expecting to find a boulder or maybe an old piece of farm equipment left behind by the previous owner. Instead, he found the top of a wooden door frame. Tommy had worked farms all his life, first with his father in Illinois, and now on the 200 acres he'd bought outside the town of Millbrook after his divorce. He'd seen plenty of odd things turn up in fields, rusted tools, broken pottery, even an old car bumper from the 1950s. But he'd never seen anything like this. The door frame was made of dark wood, weathered but still solid, with brass hinges that showed green corrosion despite being buried. Tommy cleared away more soil with his hands, revealing a complete door frame standing upright in the earth, tall enough for a person to walk through, wide enough for a standard residential door, but with no door attached and no building around it. It was just a door frame, standing alone in the middle of his field like someone had built a house and then removed everything except the front entrance. Tommy walked around the structure, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The frame was perfectly vertical, professionally installed, with mortise and tenon joints that spoke of quality craftsmanship. But it was surrounded by empty field on all sides, with no foundation, no walls, and no indication that a building had ever stood there. His first instinct was to pull it out with the tractor and get back to plowing. The growing season was short, and he had corn to plant before the weather turned. But something about the doorframe held his attention, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't quite articulate. Tommy decided to leave it alone for the day and finish plowing the rest of the field. He could always come back with the tractor and remove it later. That night, he called his neighbor, Earl Morrison, who'd farmed the adjacent property for 40 years. "Earl, did the Hendersons ever have a building in the south field? Maybe an old farmhouse or barn that got torn down?" Earl's pause lasted long enough to make Tommy wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, the older man's voice came back, cautious and measured. "Tommy, why are you asking about the south field?" "I found something out there today. A door frame buried in the dirt. Looks like it's been there for years." Another pause. "What kind of door frame?" Tommy described what he'd found, the dark wood and brass hinges, the way it stood perfectly vertical in the middle of nowhere. As he spoke, he could hear Earl's breathing change, becoming shallow and quick. "Tommy, listen to me carefully," Earl said. "Don't touch that thing. Don't try to move it. Don't dig around it. And for God's sake, don't go near it after dark." "What are you talking about? It's just an old door frame." "It's not just anything, son. That door's been there since before the Hendersons bought the land. Been there since before my daddy farmed these parts. It's older than any of us, and it's best left alone." Tommy wanted to ask more questions, but Earl had already hung up. The next morning, Tommy returned to the south field with coffee and curiosity. The doorframe looked exactly as he'd left it, standing in the churned earth like a monument to nothing. In daylight, it seemed less mysterious and more like a simple oddity, probably a remnant from some long-forgotten building project. Tommy decided to dig around the base to see how deep the frame extended. Maybe understanding its construction would explain its purpose. The digging revealed more questions than answers. The doorframe's posts extended down at least 4 feet, set in concrete footings that looked professionally installed. But there was no evidence of a floor, no remains of walls or foundation stones, nothing to suggest that a building had ever been attached to the frame. It was as if someone had carefully constructed a doorway to nowhere and then built it in the middle of an empty field. Tommy was so absorbed in his excavation that he didn't notice the cows until they were already gathered around him. His cattle normally grazed in the north pasture, separated from the south field by 2 fences and a creek, but somehow all 37 head had made their way across his property to stand in a perfect circle around the doorframe. They weren't grazing or moving or making any of the usual bovine noises. They just stood there, facing the wooden structure, as still as statues in a museum. "What the hell?" Tommy muttered, climbing out of the hole he'd dug. The cows didn't acknowledge his presence. Their eyes were fixed on the doorframe with an intensity that Tommy had never seen in livestock. It was the kind of focus he'd seen in hunting dogs on point, or cats watching birds, predatory awareness mixed with patience. Tommy tried to move the cattle back to their proper pasture, but they refused to budge. They stood their ground around the doorframe with the stubbornness that only cows can muster, no amount of shouting or arm waving able to break their vigil. Finally, Tommy gave up and went to call the veterinarian. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie had been treating Tommy's livestock since he'd moved to Millbrook. She was a practical woman who'd grown up on a dairy farm and understood cattle behavior better than most people understood their own families. But when she saw Tommy's cows arranged around the doorframe, her professional composure cracked. "How long have they been like this?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "Since this morning, maybe longer. I've never seen them behave this way." Dr. Mackenzie approached the nearest cow and ran her hands along its flank, checking for signs of illness or distress. The animal was healthy, alert, and completely unresponsive to her examination. Its attention remained fixed on the wooden doorframe with unwavering intensity. "Tommy, have you noticed anything else unusual? Changes in their feeding patterns, milk production, anything out of the ordinary?" "Just this. They broke through 2 fences and crossed a creek to get here. That's not normal behavior for cattle." Dr. Mackenzie examined several more animals with the same results. The cows were physically healthy but mentally elsewhere, as if they were listening to something that human ears couldn't detect. "I'm going to take some blood samples," she said finally. "Run some tests, check for toxins or infections that might cause neurological symptoms. But Tommy, I've never seen livestock behave like this. It's like they're waiting for something." That evening, Tommy sat on his porch with a beer and binoculars, watching his cattle maintain their vigil around the doorframe. The sun set behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the field, but the cows never moved. As darkness fell, Tommy noticed something that made his blood run cold. The doorframe was glowing. Not brightly, and not with any kind of artificial light. It was more like the phosphorescence he'd seen on old watch dials, a subtle green radiance that seemed to come from within the wood itself. Tommy grabbed a flashlight and walked out to the field, drawn by curiosity and dread in equal measure. The cows were still there, still arranged in their perfect circle, but now their eyes reflected his flashlight beam like mirrors. As he got closer to the doorframe, Tommy could hear something that made his skin crawl, a low humming sound, just at the edge of perception, like electrical wires under load, or a swarm of insects in the distance. The sound was coming from the other side of the doorframe. Tommy walked around to look through the wooden structure from different angles. From the south side, looking north, he could see across his field to the farmhouse lights in the distance. Normal view, normal countryside, normal everything. But when he looked through the doorframe from the north side, facing south, he saw something impossible. Instead of his own field and the tree line beyond, Tommy saw a different landscape entirely. Rolling hills covered with crops he didn't recognize, under a sky that was slightly the wrong color of blue. In the distance, he could make out buildings with architectural styles he'd never seen before, tall, narrow structures with pointed roofs that looked almost medieval. And walking among those impossible crops were figures that might have been human but were too far away to identify clearly. Tommy rubbed his eyes, convinced that fatigue and stress were playing tricks on his vision. But when he looked again, the alien landscape was still there, visible only when viewed from one specific direction through the wooden doorframe. He was looking at another world. Tommy backed away from the doorframe, his rational mind rejecting what his eyes were reporting. The humming sound grew louder as he retreated, almost as if whatever was on the other side was trying to communicate with him. The cows remained motionless, watching, waiting. Tommy spent a sleepless night researching his property's history online and at the county courthouse. What he found there didn't explain the doorframe, but it did explain Earl Morrison's reluctance to discuss it. The land had changed hands frequently over the past century, more often than was normal for agricultural property. Previous owners had sold after just a few years, usually citing personal reasons or family emergencies that required immediate relocation. But the most interesting discovery was a 1923 newspaper article about a scientific expedition that had camped on the property for several months. The article was vague about the expedition's purpose, mentioning only that distinguished researchers from the university were conducting geological surveys of unusual formations. The expedition had ended abruptly when 3 team members disappeared during a thunderstorm. Their bodies were never found, and the remaining researchers packed up their equipment and left town without filing a final report. The newspaper article included a photograph of the expedition's campsite. In the background, barely visible, was a wooden structure that looked suspiciously like a doorframe standing alone in an open field. Tommy called Earl Morrison again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. He drove to Earl's farm and found the house dark, the driveway empty, and a for sale sign planted in the front yard. Earl Morrison had left town sometime during the night, abandoning 40 years of farming and a property that had been in his family for 3 generations. Over the following weeks, Tommy tried to maintain his normal farming routine, but the doorframe dominated his thoughts and his daily schedule. The cows never left their posts around the wooden structure, forcing him to bring feed and water to them in the field. Worse still, the doorframe's influence seemed to be spreading. His chickens began laying eggs with shells that were perfectly transparent, revealing the developing embryos within. His pigs started digging geometric patterns in their pen, creating designs that looked almost like maps or blueprints. And his barn cat disappeared for 3 days, returning with fur that had changed from black to silver and eyes that now reflected light like mirrors. The view through the doorframe changed daily. Sometimes Tommy saw the rolling hills and medieval buildings. Other times he glimpsed vast cities with architecture that defied gravity, or empty landscapes under alien constellations, or forests filled with trees that moved like slow dancers. But always there were figures in the distance, watching, waiting, growing closer. Tommy knew he should destroy the doorframe, should pull it down with his tractor and burn the wood and fill in the hole. But every time he approached with tools or equipment, the humming sound grew louder, and the cows pressed closer, forming an impenetrable barrier around their mysterious shrine. It was as if his own livestock were protecting the doorframe from interference. On Halloween night, exactly 6 weeks after he'd first uncovered the wooden structure, Tommy woke to find his farmyard filled with animals. Not just his own cattle, but sheep from neighboring farms, horses from the stables 5 miles away, dogs and cats from throughout the township. They had all gathered around the doorframe in concentric circles, hundreds of animals standing in perfect formation under the October moon. And through the doorframe, Tommy could see that the figures from the other world were finally close enough to identify. They were animals too, cattle and horses and sheep, but walking upright like humans, wearing clothes and carrying tools. Their eyes held intelligence that went far beyond anything that belonged in the natural world. As Tommy watched, one of the creatures stepped through the doorframe into his field. It looked like a cow, but it walked on 2 legs and wore a simple tunic made of woven grass. Its eyes met Tommy's across the crowded farmyard, and when it spoke, its voice carried the weight of centuries. "The threshold has been maintained long enough," it said. "Your animals have called us home. The exchange can finally begin." Tommy understood then that the doorframe wasn't just a portal between worlds, it was a trading post. A place where animals from different realities could cross over, where intelligence and instinct could be bartered and exchanged. His cattle had been waiting for their counterparts to arrive, ready to trade places with creatures who had evolved beyond the limitations of their original forms. The exchange began at midnight and continued until dawn. Tommy watched from his porch as animals walked through the doorframe in both directions, his livestock disappearing into the alien landscape, while their evolved counterparts took their places in his pastures. When the sun rose, the doorframe had returned to its normal wood color, and the humming had stopped. But Tommy's farm was now populated by creatures that looked like ordinary animals but possessed intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. His new cattle could open gates, solve complex problems, and seem to understand human speech perfectly. His chickens laid eggs that contained detailed star charts instead of embryos. His pigs arranged themselves into living computer circuits that could perform calculations faster than any machine. Tommy realized that he was no longer a farmer in any traditional sense. He had become a caretaker for a menagerie of evolved animals who had chosen Earth as their new home. The doorframe still stands in the middle of his field, no longer glowing but never truly inactive. Sometimes, late at night, Tommy can see movement on the other side, his original livestock living in a world where animals have learned to build cities and write poetry and contemplate the mysteries of existence. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, Tommy walks through the doorframe himself, visiting a reality where the boundary between human and animal intelligence has been completely erased. He always comes back to his own world eventually, but each trip leaves him a little different, a little more aware of the arbitrary nature of consciousness, a little more understanding of the animals that now share his farm. The other farmers in Millbrook think Tommy has developed revolutionary animal husbandry techniques. His livestock are healthier, more productive, and more cooperative than any in the county. Agricultural colleges send students to study his methods, but Tommy can never explain his success in terms they would understand. How do you tell people that your animals are actually refugees from another dimension, grateful emigrants who traded places with their less evolved counterparts in search of a world where intelligence is valued regardless of the species that possesses it? The doorframe continues to facilitate exchanges, though less frequently now. Sometimes Tommy finds new animals in his pastures, creatures that look familiar but possess abilities that defy natural law. And sometimes his evolved livestock disappear for a few days, returning with knowledge of technologies and philosophies that exist only in worlds where animals learn to think before humans learn to domesticate. Tommy has stopped trying to understand the mechanics of what he's witnessed. Some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than explained, and some doorways lead to destinations that can only be reached by those willing to question the fundamental assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of reality itself. His farm has become a sanctuary for minds that were born in the wrong bodies, a refuge for consciousness that refused to be limited by the arbitrary boundaries of species and evolution. And in the middle of it all, the doorframe stands as a monument to the possibility that intelligence comes in forms we never imagined, waiting patiently for the next exchange between worlds, where the definition of personhood extends far beyond the limits of human understanding. Marcus Rodriguez had been a volunteer EMT in Birch County for 6 years, ever since he'd moved to the area after his discharge from the Army. The work suited him. It was demanding but meaningful, dangerous but necessary, and it kept him connected to a community that had welcomed him with the kind of small-town hospitality that you couldn't find in cities. Birch County covered 400 square miles of rural Maine, most of it forest and farmland dotted with isolated homes where people valued privacy above convenience. Marcus had learned every back road, every hidden driveway, and every shortcut that could shave precious minutes off response times to medical emergencies. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on November 12th, dispatched as a medical emergency at 1247 Deer Run Trail. The address was familiar, a single-wide trailer deep in the woods, home to Frank Sullivan, a 72-year-old retiree who lived alone with his 3 cats and a drinking problem that had landed him in the ER twice in the past year. Marcus was the closest unit, about 15 minutes out through winding forest roads that turned treacherous in the November drizzle. He radioed his ETA to dispatch and settled in for the careful drive through the darkness. Deer Run Trail was barely more than a dirt track that wound between massive pine trees for nearly 2 miles before reaching Frank's trailer. Marcus had been there before, once for chest pains that turned out to be acid reflux, once for a fall that resulted in a sprained wrist, and a lecture about the dangers of mixing alcohol with prescription medications. Frank was a decent guy despite his problems, a Vietnam veteran who'd never quite figured out how to live with the peace that followed the war. He'd been widowed for 15 years and had no children, which made him exactly the kind of isolated senior citizen that EMTs worried about during long Maine winters. Marcus pulled up to the trailer and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The porch light was off, which was unusual for Frank, who always kept exterior lights burning as a beacon for emergency responders. The trailer's windows were dark, and there was no sign of the old blue pickup truck that Frank drove to town for groceries and medical appointments. Marcus grabbed his medical kit and approached the front door, noting that the wooden steps leading to the entrance were slick with rain and decomposing leaves. He knocked loudly, calling out as he'd been trained to do. "Frank, it's Marcus from the EMT service. Are you okay in there?" No response. Marcus tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which wasn't unusual for a rural area where people still trusted their neighbors. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately hit by a smell that made his stomach lurch. It was the smell of death. Not the clean, clinical death of hospitals, but the organic decay that happened when a body was left undisturbed for days. Marcus had encountered it before during welfare checks, and knew what it meant before he'd even turned on his flashlight. The beam revealed Frank Sullivan sitting in his recliner facing the television that was tuned to static. Frank's eyes were open but sightless. His skin was gray and mottled, and his mouth hung open in an expression that might have been surprise or pain. Marcus didn't need medical training to know that Frank had been dead for at least 48 hours, probably longer. The body showed clear signs of decomposition, and the smell confirmed that death had occurred days ago, not within the time frame of a 911 call. Marcus backed out of the trailer and radioed dispatch, his voice carefully professional despite the confusion swirling in his mind. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I've got a deceased male at 1247 Deer Run Trail. No signs of foul play, appears to be natural causes. I'm going to need the coroner and a supervisor out here." "Copy that, Unit 47. Can you confirm the time of death?" "Negative. Subject has been deceased for several days, possibly up to a week based on decomposition." "Dispatch, I need to ask, what was the nature of the original call?" A pause while the dispatcher checked the logs. "Unit 47, the call came in at 2:43 a.m. as a medical emergency. Male caller reported chest pains and difficulty breathing." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. "Dispatch, can you pull the audio recording of that call?" "Stand by, Unit 47. Marcus waited outside the trailer, breathing deeply to clear his lungs of the death smell. The November rain continued to fall through the pine trees, creating a steady patter on the trailer's metal roof that sounded almost like fingertips drumming against aluminum. "Unit 47, I've got the audio. Male caller, elderly, reports chest pains and requests immediate medical assistance. Clear speech, no obvious distress in his voice. Gave his name as Frank Sullivan and confirmed the address as 1247 Deer Run Trail." "Dispatch, what was the timestamp on that call?" 2:43 a.m., November 12th. Marcus looked at his watch, 3:22 a.m., November 12th. According to the dispatcher, Frank Sullivan had called for medical help less than an hour ago, reporting chest pains in a clear, calm voice. But Frank Sullivan had been dead for days. Marcus spent the next hour waiting for the coroner and his supervisor, trying to make sense of what had happened. The most logical explanation was some kind of administrative error, perhaps an old 911 call that had been delayed in the system, or a training exercise that had been accidentally dispatched as a real emergency. But when Coroner Janet Riley arrived, her preliminary examination confirmed what Marcus already knew. Frank Sullivan had died approximately 3 to 4 days earlier, most likely from a heart attack based on his medical history and the position of his body. "Poor old guy probably died alone, watching TV," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "It happens more often than people like to think." Supervisor Tom Bradley pulled Marcus aside while the coroner did her work. Bradley was a 20-year veteran of emergency services who'd seen every kind of medical call imaginable. "Marcus, walk me through exactly what happened tonight." Marcus recounted the dispatch call, the drive to the trailer, and the discovery of Frank's body. As he spoke, Bradley's expression grew increasingly troubled. "You said the dispatcher played back the 911 recording?" "Yeah, clear as day." Frank's voice, giving his name and address, reporting chest pains. "But Tom, he's been dead for days. There's no way he made that call." Bradley pulled out his radio and contacted dispatch directly. "This is Supervisor Bradley. I need you to pull up the 911 recording from the Frank Sullivan call tonight and verify the origin of that call." The response came back after several minutes of hold time. "Supervisor Bradley, we show the call originating from 207-555-0147, which is registered to Frank Sullivan at 1247 Deer Run Trail. The call came through the landline system at 2:43 a.m. Marcus and Bradley looked at each other, then at the trailer. The phone line was clearly visible, running from a utility pole to the side of the mobile home. If the call had come from Frank's landline, it had been made from inside the trailer where his body sat decomposing in the recliner. "Tom, this is impossible," Marcus said. "Dead people don't make phone calls." "Let's check the phone," Bradley replied, but his voice carried a note of dread. They re-entered the trailer, breathing through their mouths to minimize the death smell. The cordless phone sat in its charging base on the kitchen counter, seemingly normal except for one detail that made Marcus's skin crawl. The phone's digital display showed the last number dialed 911. The timestamp read 2:43 a.m. November 12th. Marcus stared at the display while Bradley examined the phone more closely. The call was definitely made from this phone, Bradley confirmed. Batteries fully charged, no signs of malfunction. But how is that possible? Bradley looked toward the living room where Frank's body sat in eternal vigil before the static-filled television. "Marcus, in 20 years of emergency services, I've learned that there are things we can't explain. People who call for help after they're already gone. Houses that dial 911 when they're empty. Voices that speak through telephone lines even when the speakers are dead." "You're saying this has happened before?" "Not often, but often enough that there's a protocol for it. We investigate, we document, and we file it under unexplained phenomena. Because sometimes, Marcus, the dead need help too." Over the next few days, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Frank Sullivan's impossible phone call. He researched similar incidents online and found scattered reports of posthumous 911 calls, most of them dismissed as hoaxes or technical glitches. But Marcus had heard the audio recording himself. It was Frank's voice, unmistakably, speaking with the clarity and urgency of someone experiencing a medical emergency. Not the voice of a man who'd been dead for days, but the voice of someone very much alive and in need of help. A week later, Marcus received a call that made everything worse. The dispatcher's voice carried an odd note as she relayed the information. "Unit 47, we've got a medical emergency at 1247 Deer Run Trail. Male caller reporting chest pains and difficulty breathing." Marcus felt the temperature drop around him. "Dispatch, can you repeat that address?" 1247 Deer Run Trail. Are you available to respond?" "Dispatch, that's Frank Sullivan's trailer. Frank Sullivan died last week. I was the responding EMT." The pause. "Unit 47, the call just came in 30 seconds ago. Male caller gave his name as Frank Sullivan and requested immediate medical assistance." Marcus drove to Deer Run Trail for the second time in 8 days, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The trailer was exactly as they'd left it after the coroner had removed Frank's body, empty, cleaned, and secured with police tape. But the porch light was on. Marcus approached the trailer with growing dread, noting that the front door was slightly ajar despite being locked and sealed the previous week. He called out, more from protocol than hope. "Frank, it's Marcus from the EMT service. Are you okay in there?" This time, there was a response. "I'm not alone anymore," came Frank's voice from inside the trailer, clear and distinct and impossible. "Please hurry, I'm not alone anymore." Marcus should have called for backup. He should have retreated to his ambulance and waited for law enforcement. Instead, he pushed open the door and stepped into the trailer, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The living room was empty, exactly as the cleanup crew had left it, but the television was on, tuned to a channel that showed nothing but static, and the cordless phone was lying on the floor beneath the kitchen table. "Frank?" Marcus called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "In here," came the reply from the bedroom. "I'm not alone anymore. They're here with me now." Marcus followed the voice to the small bedroom at the back of the trailer. The room was empty, but the closet door was open, revealing clothes hanging in neat rows and the smell of mothballs and old cologne. "Frank, where are you?" "I'm right here," Frank's voice replied, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm not alone anymore, Marcus. They came for me. All of them. Everyone who died alone in these woods. Everyone who called for help that never came. We're all here together now." Marcus backed toward the door, but it swung shut before he could reach it. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and frost began forming on the windows despite the November warmth outside. "Don't leave," Frank's voice pleaded. "Don't leave us alone again. We've been waiting so long for someone to answer our calls." The closet began to fill with shadows that moved independently of any light source. The shadows took vague human shapes, dozens of them, crowding together like people pressed into a too small elevator. And from those shadows came voices, all speaking at once in a chorus of desperate need. "Please help us. Don't let us be alone. We called but no one came. We're still waiting for the ambulance." Marcus understood then that Frank's impossible phone calls weren't the end of something, they were the beginning. Frank had been recruited into a collective of people who had died alone in the rural reaches of Birch County, people whose final moments had been spent calling for help that arrived too late or not at all. And now they were calling Marcus to join them, to become part of their eternal emergency response team, forever answering calls from the dead who refused to accept that help would never arrive. Marcus ran. He burst through the bedroom door across the living room, and out into the November night, not stopping until he reached his ambulance. Behind him, the trailer's lights flickered and went out, but not before he glimpsed dozens of figures pressed against the windows, pale faces with eyes that held all the loneliness and fear of dying alone. Marcus never reported what he'd experienced in Frank Sullivan's trailer. The official record shows that he responded to a false alarm, found the residence empty and secure, and returned to service without incident. But he knew that Frank Sullivan and his growing congregation of the alone and abandoned were still there, still making their impossible phone calls, still waiting for help that could never arrive because the only assistance they needed was companionship in death. Over the following months, Marcus received 3 more calls to 1247 Deer Run Trail. Each time, the dispatcher relayed reports of medical emergencies called in by Frank Sullivan. Each time, Marcus found the trailer empty but increasingly active, lights that turned on by themselves, a phone that dialed 911 without human intervention, and voices that spoke from rooms where no living person stood. The calls always carried the same message: "I'm not alone anymore." Marcus eventually transferred to a different county, but he still monitors the Birch County emergency frequencies on his scanner. Frank Sullivan continues to call for help several times a month, his voice unchanged by death or time. And sometimes, late at night when the radio traffic is slow, Marcus hears other voices joining Frank's calls, new members of the collective, people who died alone and found companionship only in death, building a community of the abandoned who refused to stay silent in their eternal solitude. The EMT service continues to respond to the calls from 1247 Deer Run Trail because protocol demands that every 911 call receive a response, even when the caller has been dead for months. But the new EMTs know what they're walking into now. They know that Frank Sullivan's trailer has become a gathering place for the lonely dead, a phantom dispatch center where abandoned souls call for the help they never received in life. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, they answer, not because they can provide medical assistance to the dead, but because everyone living or dead deserves to know that someone cares enough to respond when they call for help, even if that help comes too late to matter in any traditional sense. Frank Sullivan's impossible phone calls continue, marking time not with the rhythm of a living heart, but with the persistence of loneliness that refuses to accept the silence of death. And somewhere in the woods of Birch County, in a trailer that should be empty but never truly is, the dead practice the art of emergency response, calling for help, answering each other's calls, and building the kind of community they never found while alive. The only medicine they can offer is companionship, but sometimes that's the most powerful healing of all. The first thing Maya Chen noticed when she woke up on Tuesday morning was that her bedroom window was on the wrong wall. She lay in bed for several minutes, staring at morning sunlight streaming through glass that should have been facing the neighbor's fence, but was now somehow positioned where her closet door used to be. The closet door was now where the window should have been, and her desk had moved from the corner to a spot along the opposite wall. Maya was 11 years old enough to know that furniture didn't rearrange itself overnight, but young enough to wonder if maybe she was still dreaming. She closed her eyes, counted to 10, and opened them again. The room was still wrong. Maya got dressed quickly, choosing clothes from a closet that felt like a funhouse mirror version of her own. Everything was there, her favorite sweaters, her school uniforms, her collection of horse figurines, but arranged in ways that made no sense based on her memory of how she'd organized things. Downstairs, her parents were having breakfast in the kitchen, which now had blue cabinets instead of white ones and a refrigerator that hummed with a slightly different pitch than she remembered. "Mom," Maya said carefully, "didn't our kitchen cabinets used to be white?" Her mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, looked up from her coffee with the distracted smile of someone already thinking about her morning patients. "What? No, honey. They've always been blue. We picked this color when we moved in 6 years ago. Remember?" Maya remembered moving to Millbrook when she was 5, remembered helping her parents unpack boxes in a kitchen with white cabinets and yellow walls. Now the walls were sage green, and the cabinets were definitely blue, but her parents seemed to have no memory of any change. "Dad, what color were the kitchen cabinets yesterday?" Her father, Tom Chen, didn't look up from his tablet where he was reading the morning news. "Same as they are today, Maya Blue. Why are you asking such strange questions?" Maya wanted to argue, but something in her parents' casual certainty made her hesitate. They weren't lying or confused. They genuinely believed the cabinets had always been blue. The wrongness extended beyond furniture and paint colors to include the very memories of the people who lived with them. The walk to school provided more evidence that something fundamental had changed in Millbrook overnight. Morrison's diner, which had been painted red with white trim for as long as Maya could remember, was now yellow with blue trim. The hardware store's sign read Henderson's Hardware instead of Morrison's Hardware. The park on Elm Street had a playground that was completely different from the one Maya had played on just yesterday. Different equipment, different layout, different colors. But most disturbing of all were the subtle changes to the buildings themselves. The bank was still a bank, but it had different windows and a slightly altered roofline. The library was still in the same location, but the front entrance was now on the side of the building. The fire station looked like the same structure, but painted in colors that Maya was certain had been different the day before. Maya arrived at Millbrook Elementary to find that her confusion was shared by exactly 2 other people, her best friend Jake Morrison, and a quiet kid named Alex Rivera who was in the grade below them. "The whole town's wrong," Jake whispered to Maya as they stood in the hallway before first period. "My house is still my house, but everything's in different places. My mom doesn't remember that my dad painted the garage last weekend. She thinks it's always been green instead of white." "Same thing happened to me," Alex added, joining their whispered conversation despite the fact that he'd never spoken to either of them before. "My bedroom is backwards, like someone flipped it in a mirror, but my parents think I'm crazy for saying anything's different." Maya looked around the school hallway, noting changes that seemed designed to be subtle but unmistakable once you knew to look for them. The trophy case was on the opposite wall from where it had been yesterday. The main office had moved from the right side of the entrance to the left side. The cafeteria was now painted purple instead of yellow. But everyone else, students, teachers, staff, moved through the transformed school as if nothing had changed at all. "Why can only we see it?" Maya asked. "Maybe we're the only ones who remember," Jake suggested. "Maybe something happened to everyone else's memories. Or maybe something happened to the whole town," Alex said quietly, "and we're the only ones who weren't affected." Their first period teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was the same woman who taught Maya's class the previous day, but she was wearing different clothes and had a different hairstyle. More significantly, when she called attendance, she didn't call Maya's name. According to the class roster, Maya Chen was not a student at Millbrook Elementary. Maya raised her hand, her heart pounding with growing panic. "Mrs. Patterson, I think there's been a mistake. My name isn't on the list." Mrs. Patterson looked at Maya with the polite confusion of someone encountering a stranger. "I'm sorry, but you're not enrolled in this class. Are you supposed to be in a different room?" "I've been in this class all year, since September. You know me, Maya Chen. I sit in the 3rd row, 2nd seat. I turned in my book report on Charlotte's Web last Friday." But Mrs. Patterson's expression remained blank, as if Maya was speaking a foreign language. "I think you need to go to the main office and sort this out with Principal Williams." Maya looked desperately at Jake and Alex, but they were staring at her with expressions that mixed fear with recognition. They could see her, they knew her, but according to the official records of Millbrook Elementary, Maya Chen had never existed. During lunch break, the 3 children met behind the school to compare their experiences. "The attendance roster," Jake said urgently. "Alex's name wasn't on it either." "But I've been at this school for 3 years. Alex protested. "I know all the teachers, I have friends in my old classes. I remember everything about being here. But nobody remembers us," Maya realized. "The town changed, but we didn't change with it. Now we don't fit into the new version." Jake pulled out his phone and showed them something that made Maya's blood run cold. "Look at this. I searched for my dad's construction business online. Morrison Construction used to be the biggest contractor in the county. Now it doesn't exist. The website's gone, the business listing is gone, even the phone number belongs to someone else." Maya tried the same search for her mother's medical practice. Dr. Lisa Chen had been Millbrook's only pediatrician for 6 years, but according to the internet, no such person had ever worked in the town. The clinic where Maya had visited her mother hundreds of times was now run by Dr. Michael Foster, who, according to his biography, had been practicing in Millbrook for over a decade. "This is bigger than just the town changing," Alex said quietly. "Our families changed too. Our whole lives changed, but we remember the old versions." That afternoon, Maya made a devastating discovery. When she returned home from school, the house at 1247 Maple Street, her house where she'd lived for 6 years, was occupied by a different family entirely. A woman Maya had never seen before answered the door, holding a baby that definitely didn't belong to the Chen family. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong house," the woman said kindly. "This is the Peterson residence. We've lived here for 8 years." Maya stood on the front porch of her own home, looking through the doorway at furniture she didn't recognize, family photos that showed strangers, and a living room painted in colors her parents had never chosen. "But this is my house," Maya said weakly. "My family lives here. The Chens, Dr. Lisa Chen and Tom Chen." The woman's expression shifted from kindness to concern. "Honey, are you lost? Do you need me to call someone?" Maya backed away from the door, understanding that she couldn't explain the situation without sounding like a confused or troubled child. In this version of Millbrook, the Chen family had never lived at 1247 Maple Street. According to all available evidence, the Chen family had never lived in Millbrook at all. Maya walked through the town until she found Jake and Alex at the park, the one with playground equipment that was completely different from what had been there yesterday. They were sitting on swings that Maya had never seen before, in a park that felt familiar but wrong in dozens of subtle ways. "My family's gone too," Jake reported. "The Morrisons never lived in Millbrook. Our house belongs to a family called the Hendersons now, and they've been there for 15 years according to the neighbors." "Same here," Alex said. "The Riveras are gone like we never existed. But here's the really weird part. We're still here. We still exist. We still remember everything. But we don't belong to this version of the town." Maya sat on a swing that creaked with a sound she didn't recognize. "So what are we? Ghosts? Time travelers? Refugees from a different reality?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but I know we can't go home because home doesn't exist anymore. At least not the version of home we remember." The 3 children spent the evening exploring their transformed town, documenting changes, and trying to understand the scope of what had happened to them. Every street had been altered in small ways. Different paint colors, different landscaping, different cars and different driveways. But the alterations seemed designed to preserve the essential character of Millbrook, while changing enough details to make it subtly wrong for anyone who remembered the original version. As night fell, they faced a practical problem that highlighted their displacement. None of them could go to the homes they remembered, because those homes now belonged to other families. They had no official existence in this version of Millbrook. No school records, no medical records, no legal guardians who acknowledged their existence. They were refugees from their own lives, stranded in a place that looked like home but had no room for them. Maya suggested they spend the night in the old treehouse behind the school, one of the few structures that seemed unchanged between versions of the town. As they settled into sleeping bags borrowed from the school's camping equipment, Alex asked the question that had been haunting all of them. What if we're not the only ones? What if there are other people who remember the old version but got left behind when everything changed? Over the following days, they searched for other displaced residents but found none. Teachers who should have recognized them looked through them as if they were strangers. Store clerks who had served their families for years had no memory of ever seeing them before. Even family, friends, and neighbors who had known them since birth showed no sign of recognition. Maya, Jake, and Alex had become the only witnesses to a version of Millbrook that no longer existed anywhere except in their memories. They created a hidden base in the abandoned Miller's Mill outside town, a place that seemed to exist in the spaces between the old and new versions of their community. There, they documented their memories of the original Millbrook, creating detailed maps and lists and photographs that proved, at least to themselves, that they weren't suffering from shared delusions. But as weeks passed, they faced a more disturbing possibility. What if they were slowly disappearing too? Maya noticed it first. Moments when she couldn't quite remember her mother's face, times when details of her old life seemed fuzzy or uncertain. Jake began forgetting specific conversations with his parents, and Alex lost entire memories of birthday parties and family vacations. The old version of Millbrook was fading from their minds, being gradually overwritten by the new reality that surrounded them every day. "We're like old photographs," Maya realized during one of their evening meetings at the mill. "Without anyone to look at us and remember, we're just going to fade away until there's nothing left." "Maybe that's what's supposed to happen," Alex said quietly. "Maybe we're not meant to exist in this version of the town. Maybe we're just leftovers from something that got erased." But Jake refused to accept that explanation. "No, we're still here for a reason. We remember because we're supposed to remember. We're witnesses to what happened, and maybe that's important." They began leaving evidence of their existence throughout the town, carved initials in trees, messages written in places where they might someday be found, photographs hidden in the library and school and other public buildings. If they were going to fade away, they wanted to leave proof that they had once existed, that the original version of Millbrook had been real. Maya's final memory of her mother's face disappeared on a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 3 months after the town had changed overnight. Jake lost his father's voice the following week. Alex forgot his little sister's laugh 2 days after that. But they remembered each other, and they remembered the fundamental truth that something impossible had happened to their community. A transformation so complete that it had rewritten history, altered buildings, and erased entire families from existence while leaving behind only 3 children, as evidence that another version of Millbrook had ever existed at all. On the first anniversary of the change, Maya, Jake, and Alex met at the old treehouse to mark the day when their world had ended and begun again. They were older now, more adapted to their strange existence as permanent outsiders in their own hometown. Maya had learned to forge documents that gave her a legal identity in the new Millbrook. Jake had found work doing odd jobs for people who didn't question his lack of official records. Alex had discovered that he could predict small changes before they happened, as if the town's reality was still shifting in ways too subtle for others to detect. "Do you think it will happen again?" Maya asked as they sat in the treehouse, looking out over a town that felt like home but belonged to someone else's memories. "I hope not," Jake replied, "but if it does, at least we'll know what to look for." "And maybe next time," Alex added, "we'll find a way to help other people remember too." They remain in Millbrook to this day, 3 permanent witnesses to the fragility of reality and the power of memory to preserve things that have been officially erased. They've learned to live between versions of the truth, keeping alive the memory of a town that existed for 11 years of Maya's life, 9 years of Jake's life, and 8 years of Alex's life, before being replaced overnight by something almost identical but fundamentally different. Sometimes, late at night, they hear whispers of other changes happening in other towns. Other children waking up to find their world subtly wrong, their families gone, their existence erased from all official records. And when those whispers reach them, Maya, Jake, and Alex write letters that find their way to the displaced children of altered towns. Letters that say simply, "You are not alone. You are not crazy. Your memories are real. Hold on to them, because memory is the only thing that can preserve the places and people that reality has chosen to forget." The old Millbrook lives on in their stories, their documentation, and their stubborn refusal to accept that the past can be rewritten without consequences. They are its historians, its guardians, and its only remaining residents. 3 children who grew up to become the keepers of a version of home that exists now only in the spaces between what was and what is. And in a basement room beneath Miller's Mill, surrounded by photographs and maps and detailed written accounts, the truth about the original Millbrook waits patiently for the day when reality becomes unstable enough for lost places to find their way back to existence, bringing with them the families and friends and familiar comforts that 3 children have spent years protecting from the entropy of forgotten worlds.